For brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wa afdalu salati wa atimmu taslim. Ala sayyidina wa nabiyina wa habibina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tahirin wa ridwanullahi ta'ala ala sahabatihi ar-rashidin. Wa tabi'in lahum bi khairin wa ihsan ila yawm ad-din wa alina ma'ahum bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. So we have a very special segment right now that we think is relevant here at the Michigan chapter of CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and that is addressing racism within inside the American Muslim community. And we know that Allah Azza wa Jal says in the Quran that we're supposed to be unified, that we have one ummah, and that we should not separate ourselves. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us that if we separate, that our strength, literally our rih, our wind, will leave from us, and this will be a source of calamity for us as Muslims. So in this particular time when racism is the talk of the day, and we have an election year, 2020, in which there's a lot of discussion going on about race. And Muslims have been more vocal about racism outside in the broader society. But we'd like to have a discussion to see what can we do as Muslims to address the racism, blameworthy tribalism, and the ethnocentricity that keeps us divided from being able to defend ourselves during this time in which we are facing political as well as ideological threats, primarily from the right, but even some of those coming from the left. So with that, we'd like to start with the discussion. And we have at the bottom right our beloved brother Syed Ali Jafri, who studied law, studied American constitutional law, an attorney, and he then also has studied for several years at the Islamic Seminary in Qom in Iran, so he will speak first, followed by our sister Hana Alasry, who's in the Dearborn community and has been very active in organizing in relationship to tarbiyah and other sorts of activities with mass youth. And then last but definitely not least, our elder and our teacher, Imam Saleem Khalid, who's been involved in the Muslim community here for so long, and he heads up MEP, and you should check them out, which is an organization that does convert or revert care, which is, I believe, one of the more neglected aspects within the American Muslim community there, where we call people to Islam and they accept, but then what do we do with them? How do we support them in their journey in which they may face many problems such as alienation from family, challenges culturally, and other things. So with that, we will begin first with opening comments from Sayyid Ali. Bismillah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم أخرجني من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمني بنور الفهم اللهم افتح علينا أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to CAIR and to especially Sheikh Dawud for this invitation to speak to you all today. So yesterday started off football season in Michigan, okay? And football season in Michigan is synonymous, as a Michigander, I know this. Football season in Michigan is synonymous with 3 words, okay? And it's same old Lions, okay? Same old Lions, what's that mean? For those of you who are not from Michigan, the Sheikh's smiling, alhamdulillah, done my job, okay? But for those of you not from Michigan, what does this mean? That means that every year, the Detroit Lions, this franchise that has never won a championship, they start off the year with all this optimism, and they try to fool us, right, with all this optimism and all these fancy, beautiful words, right? And what happens, it only takes 1 week sometimes, like yesterday, for the rest of us to understand, to come to our senses, and to look at each other and not even waste our time discussing it. Just simply say these 3 words, same old lines, okay? And we understand it's going to be a bunch of rhetoric and no action. Unfortunately, around the country and around Michigan today, when people saw our flyer, they probably had the same feeling, because we have brothers and sisters who are out there, they're hurting. Why are they hurting? They're hurting because of the actions that people like me have done to them, people within the Muslim community, right? And so they probably see what we're doing here today, or all these other Zoom calls all over the place during this pandemic, and they probably say to themselves, same old Muslim community. They're going to talk a big game, but when the pandemic's over, they're going to go back to their racist spaces. Okay, so what we want to do here tonight is try to think of some ways where we can activate our rhetoric. And alhamdulillah, it's happening. I'm not saying it's not happening. It's definitely happening. There's a lot of good work being done in a lot of different places. But the fact that we have to have this conversation shows that there's room for improvement. Sometimes I reflect on the letter of Shaheed Malcolm X that he sent from Hajj. And when Shaheed sent this letter, what does he say? He says that he experienced true brotherhood. He doesn't say, over here, I opened up the Holy Quran and I went to Surah Hujurat and I saw that it says, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. He doesn't say that. He says that I experienced it. But what he experienced were Muslims like me and you who actually were actualizing that beautiful verse of the Holy Quran, who were living that verse of the Holy Quran. So this is what we need to do when we move forward. Now today, I don't want to take a lot of time because we have these respected panelists who I came here to learn from, but I just want to give one example of what we can do to try to address these issues, because we have problems when it comes to marriage. We have problems when it comes to the brothers who are coming out of the prisons. We have problems when it comes to representation on our boards in many of our organizations, right? So what's one thing we can do? One thing we can do is to look at ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, alaykum anfusukum, right? Look first to yourself. Our responsibility is first with ourselves. I remember when I used to work full-time as a lawyer, what I used to do is I used to conduct investigations into discrimination and harassment. A lot of times when I looked at these cases that were of disparate treatment, disparate impact vis-a-vis race, what really was interesting was that these individuals who were the bad actors, who were doing racist actions, making racist remarks, for example, they honestly didn't believe what they were doing was wrong. They honestly didn't believe what they were doing was racist or prejudiced or had, a hint of asabiyah. But this is not actually all that surprising, because when we look at the concept of jahl, the concept of ignorance, it can be divided into two. So I'll give you an example with a doctor's appointment, okay? Let's say I wake up sick today, okay, God forbid. I wake up sick today and I say, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling well. But you know what I understand? I understand that I'm not a doctor, right? I understand that I'm ignorant. I understand that there's some jahl, there's some ignorance here, okay? So what can I do? Because I understand my own ignorance, I'm able to get treated. I say, look, I got to go to the doctor, okay? But let's say I wake up, I'm feeling sick, and I'm like, you know what? I'm feeling sick. I'm not a doctor, but you know what I'm going to do? I think I know how to handle this. I'm going to eat Snickers all day. I'm just going to eat a lot of Snickers, okay? Now, the problem isn't that I don't know what to do. The problem is that I don't know that I don't know. I have compound ignorance. And when you have compound ignorance, you are not going to be able to get treated for a physical disease, and you are not going to be able to get treated for a spiritual disease either. And that's what this racism is, brothers and sisters. It's a spiritual disease, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even address it. When shaitan says, Ana khayru min, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even address it. He says, Fahbit minha. He says, get out of here. He doesn't even address it. It's not even worthy. It's so antithetical to our beliefs as Muslims. Okay, so what can we do? Number one, understand that this issue of compound ignorance exists within all of us, right? We all have our own implicit biases. I can look at myself first and foremost. I was born and raised in America, probably the most racist country that you can be born and raised into. If I think that, that educational system hasn't affected me, I'm kidding myself. I went to University of Texas for law. 30 years before I was born, the University of Texas in Sweat versus Painter was trying to deny African Americans the right to come into their school still. 30 years before I was born. It's not ancient history. So to think that that education hasn't had some effect on me, I'm kidding myself, right? And we see this in our Muslim community. We have brothers and sisters, they say things like, Muslim is the new black, right? What are they saying? They're saying, oh yeah, because TSA came and pulled me over, and now I understand the black experience. This is that jahl murakkab. This is that compound ignorance. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from our own ignorances. And we ask him, to allow us to become humble so that we can get educated. Inshallah, I pass it on to my respected teachers. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallahu khairan, Sayyidina. Thank you very much. Sister Hana actually just dropped off. She must have had some sort of connection problem. So we'll go to Imam Saleem next for his opening comments. Bismillah. Sheikh, you have to unmute.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm going to keep my remarks short, inshallah ta'ala. I really want to get into the substance of this. I want to hear what Sister Hana has to say. Alhamdulillah for the opening by our Sheikh Ali. Just a couple of things. First and foremost, I was reading a piece earlier today, and this article that I was reading was about some issues that others have pointed to within the Muslim community. And I was thinking as I was reading that addressing issues, especially uncomfortable issues, and this issue of race, this issue of tribalism is historically an uncomfortable issue for human beings. And it's, I think, really especially uncomfortable today in the Muslim community, because to acknowledge that racism exists, to acknowledge that this tribalism exists, is to acknowledge that we, in fact, and I say we, in fact, as Muslims, are really not on our Islamic game. It's to say that we're performing at a level beneath what is expected of us as Muslims. And I think that's a comfortable statement to make. Now, I'm not, I'll point fingers at myself first and foremost relative to it, but I think everyone would agree that we've got work to do, okay? And how does it manifest itself? It manifests itself in so many different ways, oftentimes subtly, and oftentimes very, very obvious and open. And when I say subtly, it can be as simple as a conversation around a dinner table where there are statements made by people of the same family that are less than gracious to people of other racial groups or other ethnic backgrounds. It can be as open and obvious as remarks that are made in the store. And I've had this happen on several occasions over the years, probably numerous occasions over the years, where people make the assumption when you walk in a store, let's say in a Muslim community, and you greet people in the English language. The assumption is this individual's ear is not capable of picking up a derogatory remark in Arabic. So I've heard, and I've heard others say, other individuals in the same situation say that the people talked about that person present, that would be myself, in very negative terms, just for being an African American. So these are the less than subtle situations. So I think it's comfortable for me to say that we have issues. We know we have issues. I think the situation really becomes one of, are we as a group of people, Muslims, Are we willing to acknowledge? And then more importantly, are we willing to make effort? And if so, what should that effort look like? Having said that, inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to hand the mic over to Sister Hana so we can move forward, inshallah ta'ala.
Thank you, Imam Saleem. First of all, so sorry regarding the technical difficulties. I was originally on my phone and then not sure what started happening with the connection there. I'm on my laptop now, so the camera quality is not the best, but let me know that you guys can hear me clearly. That's what's more important. So I've been in tarbiyah work for a while now, definitely not as long as Imam Dawud, but for a while now. And I think one thing particularly that stands out to me is within tarbiyah work, I also do activism work, and at times we can find that in this process of community building, community organizing, activism, really trying to make healthy, positive change in our society, we as a Muslim community become the biggest enemy to ourselves, the biggest enemy to our own progress. And both Imam Saleem and Brother Ali touched on this in different ways. And so I'm not going to expand too much. I think we'll have plenty of time to discuss this throughout our conversation. But what does it look like for us to really acknowledge what our pitfalls and our downfalls and where we're coming short as a Muslim community? I want to speak particularly to when we're talking about racism within the Muslim community. We're not just talking about anti-Blackness, which is very real and very strong. We're talking about racism that exists between different groups. We're talking about racism, colorism that exists, for example, between different communities of Arab origin. For example, I'm Yemeni, right? So we often find that, at least in our experience as Yemeni community, because a lot of us tend to have darker skin, or more, then you'll have Yemenis who are also Afro-Arab, that we're facing certain elements of racism that are often brushed to the side, but then we're expected to come forward as this united Muslim community when we're standing up against Islamophobia. Yeah, we're perpetuating Islamophobic ideals within our community. We'll talk about more examples of what that looks like. I'm really interested in understanding the psychology of it, the soulology of it. I don't know if that's a way to understand, to explain it. And then also discussing what resources as a community do we need to put forward, and how do we really call out our hypocrisy. Imam Dawud mentioned in the very beginning, right, that racism has been a hot button issue, and so you start seeing people showing up and speaking loud and hashtagging certain things and having these conversations, and then you wonder at any point, did we pull up the blinds and say, well, what am I doing to my own brothers and sisters in the Muslim community? When I've shown up for Black Lives Matter protests, have I ever stopped and thought, well, what does my masjid do that is anti-racist, that is actively anti-racist? How am I contributing to racism in my own home? What are the comments I'm making to my friends and my families and my parents? Or what are my comments that my parents are making that I kind of let slide? So I think that introspection is really important. And that's all I have to say for right now.
Thank you all for your introductory comments, and I'm sitting listening to you. And I don't think that we can, as a Muslim community, I don't think we can get woke out of our quote unquote woke out of this situation, right? And nor do I think that we can fick our way out of this issue. I don't mean fix like fick our way out of this issue. That there's an issue of jahl murakab that Sayyid Ali mentioned, hafidhahullah, and then there's also issues of spiritual diseases and spiritual maladies, right? So that has to be addressed. So here, or in that, there leads to a couple of challenges, because we have this type of bell curve, and all religious communities have a particular bell curve of religiosity. And actually, I've seen this change quite a bit in the last 12 or 15 years in the community. But you have a group of people who are on the one spectrum, and these are the people who maybe are Ashab al-Fajr. These are people that go and pray Fajr prayer regularly in Jama'ah in the masjid, right? And then the brothers who never miss Salatul Jum'ah, and will fast at least not just the fard of Ramadan, but fast every month at least 3 days. They'll fast the illuminated days, or Mondays and Thursdays, and the people who've gone to Hajj and these sort of things. Then you have people on this side, the other side, who are what we could call cultural Muslims. The extent of their Islam is maybe having a non-Anglo-Saxon last name, because some of them changed their first names. But the extent of their Islam is maybe just saying Assalamu alaikum, not eating pork, right? And even in my staff today, we were talking about even the lunacy of, even in Dearborn area, of some so-called gentlemen's clubs who have halal meat, right? So, brothers have to go and eat some halal buffalo wings while they go to the gentlemen's club, right? And this is a reality. So we have people over here. Then you have people who are kind of like ebbing and flowing and back in the middle, and their commitment to the deen is kind of ebbing and flowing, right? So I think the challenge for us is like, how, if we're going to deal with the outside challenges of the false ideology of white supremacy and how it affects Muslims, be it from the state, right, from the FBI, from Homeland Security, which also Immigration and Customs Enforcement is a part of that, and then bigots who try to block zoning on one end. On the other hand, you have this type of assault on the other hand, where people are trying to push their morality in the public space that is anti-family, that's against like our morality on the left, but maybe they're not against those overt surveillance policies that the right pushes, right? So we're kind of like in this middle position, but like, how is it that we can push people or get people to raise the knowledge level, and not just ilm, but ma'rifah, the spiritual knowledge that can guide us to being less racist, so that we can work together for our common interests, for not just us, but we're thinking about, what about our grandchildren, right? Well, will our grandchildren, and I don't have grandchildren, but will our grandchildren even be Muslim, right? Because of the challenges that they face in America. This is a real question, right? So I like to get some of your thoughts on that. I know I said a whole lot right there, but I think that there's really a lot at stake in addressing this issue beyond superficial talk about, well, racism is haram, and Bilal called the adhan on top of the Kaaba, and all of these sorts of things, right? But really superficial discussions about the issue of racism in the community. But someone jump in. This is a free-flowing conversation. We don't have to go in any order.
I can comment real quick. I what you just mentioned Imam Dawud, it brings up so much complexity in these conversations, and it reminds me of a lot of the discussions I'm having with Muslim activist friends, right? And this attempt, and I might take us over to the side a bit, but we can always reroute and get back to the main point of discussion. But I think one thing that kind of stands out to me is, in this fight, for those who do see themselves as fighting racism, being anti-racist, trying to build that understanding, trying to do that work, and also holding onto the Muslim identity, whether it's, like you mentioned, whether they are, Ashab al-Fajr or cultural Muslims. One conversation that I find myself having is, have we developed this tunnel vision where we're willing to do things and accept things that are Imanophobic? I don't know if you coined the term, but you've used it, right? Are things that are actually detrimental to Iman, in order to meet this goal that we're moving towards an anti-racist society. And so we're finding folks you mentioned, right? A lot of times we look at extreme conservatives, extreme right, and we're like, that's the enemy, right? Those are the people that are pushing these policies and this and that. And it's like, okay, so this is our enemy, this is who we fight against. And who are we allying with? The super left, who is destroying things that are the crux of our Muslim community in a way that honestly will take centuries to recover from if we allow it to go. But we have this tunnel vision, so it's like, okay, yeah, what they're doing is fine on the left because they have the same enemy. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Give me 1 second. I'm so sorry, my dad has something.
No problem. But when she goes back, this was a good point that she was making. And that's also to say, when I mentioned it, that it's not to say that people on the left are post-racial or people who call themselves progressives. I mean, I can look at Bill Maher as like a prime example, right? But it's not as if people who claim to be quote unquote progressives are post-racial either. Maybe they package some of the things they say perhaps a little bit differently, but it's not to say that the left or people who claim to be Democrats or so-called post-racial. But Bismillah, go back to your comments before we move on, sister.
Sorry, when parents come duty calls. So yeah, I was just discussing that tunnel vision because it's almost like we're trying to dig ourselves out of one hole just to throw the dirt on top of Muslims in the other hole. And it's like, okay, so where are we truly positioning ourselves as a Muslim community? That's one. And then two, just very briefly, is one larger conversation that we need to have is when we're talking strategy and we're truly saying, what do we need to do? Who do we need to ally with? Who are the organizations we need to stand with? What resources we need to put out? We need to really step back and think, what are the Islamic principles that we are foregoing while we're doing that? And if we're doing this work, and we're saying that we're doing it because we're Muslim, right? We are believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are believers in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, we're not using his principles and we're doing things contradictory to the Quran in things that are against the authentic sunnah to meet these goals. And if we do that, we're anti-productive, right? And the very last comment, and I'll step back, is one point in that as we're having these conversations is Muslims with the proper understanding, those who have studied and also understand the world of social justice, world of activism, need to be willing to stand in that arena and hold that flag up and be like, whoa, we need to stop, we need to wait. Unfortunately, the way cancel culture is nowadays, it's very scary. And a lot of times we find that people are just completely just torn apart when they mention an ayah of the Quran. And that's something that we as those who truly are trying to stick to the authentic teachings of the Prophet ﷺ need to not shy away from, because Islam was meant to be held onto, whether it's the burning hot coal that our Prophet mentioned.
Any other firmer elaboration? Sheikh Saleem, you need to unmute your mic.
I'm unmuting the picture, Imam Dawud. That's frightening. Just a couple of thoughts, and I was listening to Sister Hana. Number one, I think, again, if we go back to observing and acknowledging ourselves, I'm talking about the Muslims, where we actually are. I mean, I think that part of the challenge we have is that we want to believe that we're one place and in reality we're somewhere else. We want to believe that we embody those things that Islam speaks to, those wonderful characters, those wonderful attributes that Islam speaks to. And the reality of the situation is we, like the general public, are very much astray from our faith tradition. I think if we can begin with that, just begin with the fact we're sick, that we have issues, we have problems, and we are at varying spots on the spectrum. There are some people who are willing to acknowledge it. There's a whole lot of people who are not willing to acknowledge it. And there's a population of people, a sizable population of people that don't want to talk about it. That's fine. So we begin somewhere, okay? And then we understand that because of the way that we've been functioning as a community, I mean, when you talk in terms of a community, just the word community implies certain things. It implies that people know one another. It implies, community implies that we're concerned and we're looking out for one another. Community implies that we have stepped across and we continue to be willing to step across artificial boundaries that have been created over time by other people that are detrimental to our very existence. So again, you know, looking at the reality of our situation and dealing with it as it is, as opposed to the way that we would like it to be. And then the third piece that I want to just make reference to is that this hole that we're in is a hole that we didn't just fall into. It's not like this thing just opened up and all of a sudden the Muslims find themselves at this point in time. This is a thing that has been going on for a long, long time, internationally and domestically. What happens is when you find yourself in a situation like that, you want to be out this afternoon of that ditch or that hole. The reality of the situation is it's going to take time and sizable effort. And I'll say this and I'll close, it has to be done by people who have just an absolute resolve. An absolute resolve means, very simply, we're Muslim. This is what we stand on. These other things are alien to us. And when I say alien to us, listen, we're part and parcel of this greater society. We're going to have to figure out who we can ally with, what those relationships actually look like, what we as Muslims can give, what we're able to give. There are certain fundamental things that we just absolutely can't compromise. And with that type of understanding, that type of feeling, that type of resolve, then all of these things are doable. Everything, every challenge that we're confronted with has an appropriate response from Islam. We just have to believe we're up to task and function as if we're up to task. That's it for me.
Ahsantum. Sheikh, if I could just jump in for a second. I just want to piggyback on something that actually all three of you kind of touched on. And, you know, it brought to mind this verse of Surah Ahzab where it says, مَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لِرَجُلٍ مِّن قَلْبَيْنِ فِي جَوْفِهِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't put two hearts into, you know, a man. And a lot of what we're talking about here is actually a level of hypocrisy that exists within us, right? I remember distinctly, and I wish I could forget, but I can't, that I once went and asked a board member of one of, you know, of a national organization. I asked this individual, why is it that your board is not really reflective of your membership, right? Or of the people who, you know, are involved in this organization from an ethnic perspective. And, you know, that individual's response was that, you know, it's just that people of this particular ethnicity actually just do more work for Islam. You know, and I wish he had been joking, but he wasn't. And this actually, this kind of attitude, you know, obviously it's usually not this overt, but you see that this has a trickle-down effect. You know, from this type of an organization, now eventually, you know, people are going to be able to see the reality, and they're not going to be able to feel included, and they're going to be excluded from such an organization. And what happens then? The Muslim community gets weaker. We get splintered. And what happens then? We're easier prey for the enemies of Islam and those who want to, you know, brainwash our children, right? So these things are all connected, and it all goes back to, you know, just like the Shaykh mentioned, it all goes back to understanding Islam and as the sister mentioned, acting upon those true teachings of the Holy Prophet.
Alhamdulillah. Well, I don't want to beat around the bush, and I want to point to some direct things because these are some of the things that we have to deal with and have to address publicly that can split the community apart. And also, once we are divided, outsiders can come and use one group against another to play the Muslims off of each other, right? So, for example, Sister Hana mentioned the issue of intra, so like there can be intra-Arab racism, or there's ethnocentricity amongst Arabs themselves, and sometimes colorism, right? So, for an example, we don't delve into intra-Muslim issues of racism, right? In other words, when one Muslim is being racist towards another, let's say in their own private business, normally we don't interfere in those sorts of things because our primary job is normally to dealing with outside things. Though there's been a couple of occasions where we've had to address situations like this. But for instance, an issue of a complaint we got of a salon in southeastern Michigan, in which a Yemeni woman was disrespected, and the salon was owned by Arabs of a different national background, lighter skin hue, that basically said, well, don't book appointments for Yemenis because they're too dark, in regards to some particular type of hygiene help or enhancement for women, without being overly specific. But I'm sure some of you have heard about this situation online, right? So these are the types of things where end up spreading like wildfire within the community. But these aren't isolated issues. These are types of like one particular situation that's the icing on the cake, right? And then this plays itself out into other ways where people feel like they're discriminated against from working in certain institutions amongst Arabs themselves, right? Because of darkness of skin color, of different region. And then God forbid if someone wants to come and marry someone's daughter from that particular region, from this other country, right? I mean, that's la yumkin, like that's not going to happen, right? So these are the sorts of issues that are going on a day-to-day basis, and we're not even talking about in a environment where there's a little bit of Muslims. Like in southeastern Michigan, we have about 300,000 Muslims in this area. Like this is per capita. This is the most concentrated area of Muslims in America. And Dearborn is one of those most concentrated areas. And we still have stuff like this that goes on even in Dearborn, right? So these are types of things that takes awareness, but that community leaders and activists have to be bold enough to talk about it, instead of people making excuses for their people for stuff that's blatantly racist. And this is the very definition of al-asabiyya that the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said, tu'inu qawmaka ala dhulm. It is to support your people when you know they're wrong, but you're going to support them anyway, right? And that's the very definition. And al-unsuriya, or racism, is just an expression of al-asabiyya, right? So these are some of the things that we really have to talk about and can't be shy. And how do we hold people accountable inside the Muslim community, where they try to brush these things aside, or they think that when we talk about these things, we're only exaggerating, right? And I'll open it back up, but I'm sure, I think at least two of you know, maybe Sister Hannah doesn't know, but I grew up down south. I don't really have the accent, at least I don't think I have it. Maybe I lost it, but we have a saying down in Central Virginia, and also my kinfolk down in South Carolina would say similar, but there's a saying about don't stomp on my toe and then tell me how loud I can yell, right? Don't stomp on my toe and then tell me how hard I can yell, right? So when communities face this issue, like I don't want to see like people try to silence, like let's say Yemenis, for instance. There's something that happens to Yemenis, and they say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't complain. You're overreacting, or that looks bad for the community if the non-Muslims see, that we're arguing about racism amongst ourselves." This is part of the mentality that's holding us back from growing as a Muslim community, from my estimation, right? But I'd like to hear, Sister Hana, I'd like for you to start off in responding to what I said right there.
I had a feeling you were going to do that. Just to start off, I'm reflecting on just kind of the Islamic principle of understanding that the evil that we see in the world is a reflection of us, right? And so as the inheritors of such a beautiful message of the Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those who have this blessing of understanding the mercy to mankind, when we suck at upholding those principles, we can't expect anyone else to be doing well with that. We are supposed to be the reflection of the best of the world. And so if this is our reflection, then we really have a long way to go. And Yawm al-Qiyamah cannot come fast enough, because that's the time where the rubric, we go through the rubric and figure out what we were doing. In terms of just what you were talking about, Dawud, the same situation that you're mentioning did blow up. And one thing that I noticed as a Yemeni woman is when we were having these conversations that most of them are taking place online, is you had a lot of Yemenis saying things like, yeah, whoa, this was surprising to you? Yeah, we know this. We've seen this in multiple different spaces. Examples of we've had comments of folks in Dearborn Heights saying, we like Dearborn Heights, it's great until the Yemenis move there. Right. I've had my best friend who's Yemeni, who was working at a pharmacy in I forgot what area it was, but her owner was not Yemeni and of the lighter hue ethnicity that you're talking about, making disparaging comments about Yemenis in front of her. Another situation where a Yemeni woman was going grocery shopping, and she put down a box of dates in front of the cashier, who was of the same ethnic background, not Yemeni, but the same that we're talking about, puts it down in front of her, and the cashier looks at her and she's like, "There's no discount on this. Your people have been bothering me all day about it." And the lady was like, my people, first of all, like, at what point did you think that it was appropriate to have that tone with me, and then to make that kind of comment? And so these issues don't happen in silos, but we find that the affected communities sometimes take it almost as, yeah, this is a norm. And the unfortunate side of it is that this causes economic disparagement, right? You're talking about folks who now we are giving them their business. They're able to build their businesses, but then won't do business with us. And so our money is going there, and then our community is not being very strategic about where they're putting your money, and then we suffer as a community. Another thing, just to briefly do an analysis of, is these things have to be contextualized. And Imam Saleem, you were talking about it, right? Where if I'm speaking about the Arab Muslim population in general, you're talking about just waves of immigration. Well, look at how our present context reflects that history. You have communities in just complete little bubbles, and you have the Syrian community here, and you have the Yemeni community here, you have the Palestinian community here. And it's funny, because when we talk about the Prophet ﷺ, and we talk about Medina, and we're so infatuated with this idea of unity, and the Ansar and the Muhajirin, they were like brothers, and they even let each other like own half of their wealth, and we love this so much, but then it's not reflected in our own communities. And you can't have that conversation without talking about wealth, prosperity. What were those Muslims' priorities when they came to the United States? And then wholly, when they came, who did they ignore? Which were the Black Muslims that were in the United States, descendants of slaves, who had built a movement regarding Islamic understanding, and did that work and set that foundation, but there was no connection with that community. Right. And then we sit back and we're like, well, we made it. We did it. We built ourselves. We own our homes. We run our businesses. We have our money. We've assimilated. Why can't you? And so context, in historical context, especially, and this isn't like 1,000 years ago. This is, we're talking about immigration happening, depending on the communities, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So.
Yeah. And even when they think they assimilate, they haven't. When they called our office, when the FBI and Homeland Security is harassing them nonstop, or when their children get called sand ends and camel jockeys at the public schools, because we get those complaints and we've been getting them over the years. So even their whole idea of thinking they've assimilated into whiteness is an illusion. I call it the illusion of inclusion is what I call it. The illusion of inclusion. It's a mirage. It's not real, right?
And at what cost? Because to build and to build that status for yourself, you can't do it without sacrificing bits of your faith. And we see now the reflection of that in our community. We see when you see something on Netflix as horrible as Cuties, and I'm sure you guys have come across it, you see 10-year-olds being sexually exploited on television. Don't think that doesn't just that doesn't trickle down to the Muslim community. Like when I get young girls coming to me and telling me about things that I wouldn't have imagined that as a middle schooler I would be reflecting on or thinking about or even knew what it was. And their parents are kind of like, oh, well, where did we go wrong? It was like, maybe we went wrong when we completely separated ourselves from Islamic institutions that were already built. And we invested so much into our houses, but not into our children's Islamic development.
Bismillah, this is a window of opportunity. And I'm looking at my screen, I see 4 faces, I can't see the audience. But at the end of the day, if we put this in some kind of perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed what is happening to happen. It's happening with his permission. It couldn't happen without his permission. And the Muslims have been reluctantly dragged into the fray. We didn't come to the point where we are, where we're having these discussions, even this discussion here, by virtue of our aggressiveness in terms of being willing to look at racism. We're dealing with it now after the death of a number of people over the last year or so. So here we are, and that's, alhamdulillah, this is the way of Allah Azza wa Jal. Here we are today. Now, how do we begin to turn the corner? One of the things is that this has to be a discussion that is sustainable, it's continuous, and it goes on at all levels of the community. Again, my humble suggestion is it has to be a conversation at the dining room table and in the house. We talk about the masjids. The reality of the situation is most of the community, most of the time, even prior to COVID, are divorced from the masjid. If you look at the numbers, you might have 5 to 7% of the entire Muslim community that visit the masjid on a weekly basis, Salatul Jummah. And then you have Janazah, where people aren't talking about these kinds of issues. You have 2 Eid celebrations during the course of the year where people aren't talking about these kinds of situations. So we have to create, and it's not, we have to create environments, we have to create times where we can have these kinds of discussions. The onus is not just on the activist. The onus is on everyone that is conscious. And that's a small percentage of the community. Let's talk about the imams. Let's talk about the masjids. They have to be encouraged. They have to be forced to deal with the issue of racism in the Muslim community. How do you do that? You continue to bring it up, and you continue to let them know that it's necessary for that to be addressed in the community, not just once a year with a khutbah, but with some ongoing conversations with the community, which can be done right now during COVID-19. I'll say this, and then I'll pass the mic. Our silence is really, it has been and it continues to be a sign of tacit approval for what's taking place. When we know these things are going on in the community, when we know our young people are having issues, when we know that there's issues of this magnitude and the community is silent as if it will go away, that means it's okay. And this is not the way of a real ummah. So we just have to continue to work and to push for remediation. We've got to turn this thing around. We've got to change it.
Just jump in for a second here. I think, this whole situation and this discussion, it reminds me a little bit of the challenges that sometimes we see vis-a-vis marriage counseling, where, sometimes, especially the men, they won't want to go to marriage counseling because, they feel like it's somehow divisive, right? When actually what happens is that when we allow there to be space between us, that's when shaitan can come between us. When there's no space between us, when we're close, then the shaitan and the shayateen aren't able to infiltrate and split us up. So I think, number one, understanding that these difficult conversations are for the unity of the community. They're not for the detriment of the community. They're not to pull people apart, but it's the very opposite of that. Our silence, as the Sheikh just mentioned, is what's causing and leading to more disunity. The second point I want to mention is just, if we look at, I hate going back to football again, but, I think we as Muslims can learn from Colin Kaepernick. Unfortunately, we're not learning from Rasulullah. At least we can learn about what we're seeing in front of us, which is that, one person can make a difference, right? I'm talking to the young people out there. If you see something wrong, say something about it. Do it with adab. Don't let it be that, old people like me sit back and be like, man, look at these young cats. They don't have, no, do it with the adab, do it with the prophetic manners, right? But the young people out there, you guys have a responsibility. You have that energy, step up. You can see that one person can make a big difference.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you all for your comments. We're going to wrap this up soon. One thing is that, and Sheikh Saleem said this, that this really has to be a series of ongoing discussions. And this can't be one-time things. And, after George Floyd was brutally murdered, and, I was doing maybe 2 or 3 talks a day at different masajid across the country, from this area to New York State to, even in Canada and in the UK, where people were talking about George Floyd and the issue of anti-Black racism. And, I said to people then, well, people are protesting on the streets and it's on the news 24 hours. But what happens when all the protests stop? Are you going to continue the conversation? Right. And these centers and these people, we've moved on to other things. Right. So and it's not to say that it should be it's not to say this should be the only conversation, but it should be a continuous part of the conversation. So for those who are watching this right now, and your centers had these conversations, I would reach back out to them and say, when are we going to start having some follow-ups? That's one. One thing that I want to let people know about is that MMCC, the Imams Council that Sheikh Saleem and I are part of, we're going to be a part of a discussion along with Sheikh Muhammad al-Masmari and Sheikh Muhammad Bakr Qazwini on Friday, talking about this issue through the Imams Council. And the Imams Council has made a commitment to have these conversations with a series of different shuyukh and different centers. So hopefully this can be modeled where individual institutions can have these, we hope. And I also say, before segueing to closing comments, we've had this idea for a while, and we thought that for a couple of years now, but we're actually rolling it out starting on Thursday. We're having a 12-class series at CAIR, Michigan, on every Thursday evening. It's called the History of Racism and Resistance in America. So it'll start this Thursday. And we know that knowledge is the cure for ignorance, and that's part of the problem that we're dealing with. So we're having 12 weeks of classes where we're going over, firstly, spiritual grounding, but also dealing with specific segments of American history, such as the oppression of the Native American people, Japanese internment, the immigration issues relating to Mexicans and Mexican Americans specifically, anti-Arab and anti-Turkish sentiments that came about in America after World War I. So we're going to go through a number of these things, and we have different teachers. Professor Syed Khan from Wayne State University is one of them, amongst others. Attorney Haris Ahmed, Attorney Mona Yusuf, some of the teachers. I will be starting off with the first class. So I encourage you all who are watching this to spread the word and to watch this. And I would think that, especially since many of our youth are not in-person class right now, they're learning from home, that this would be a good time for supplemental instruction. And the Arabs have a saying, it's attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but there's no sanad to this hadith, so we can't say that he actually said this. But it's hikmah, it's a saying of wisdom, and the saying is, teaching the youth is like etching in the stone, but trying to teach the very old is like writing on the face of the water, right? So really, I know it may sound like a slogan, but really we have to really start to encourage this within the youth, because in order to have long-term cultural change and transformation, and there's no disrespect to the uncles and aunties, but I'm more concerned about reaching out to 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 17-year-olds than someone 70 or 80 years old, just to be quite frank, though they need to be a part of the conversation too. And Sarah alayhi salam gave birth at an old age, right? So I mean, we don't just discount that there can't be transformation and miraculous things, karamat amongst older people either. But as I say, that this is a very important time for us. While we're not able to travel as freely, we're not going on these vacations, we're kind of like stuck in our own areas to a degree because of this COVID-19 issue, that we take the time and take the opportunity to learn. I don't know if you can see this comment, but I see a partial comment that someone wrote, and it's relating to Sheikh Saleem. And we'll use this as an opportunity to closing comments. We'll start with Sheikh Saleem, and then Sayyid Ali, and then we'll end with Sister Hana, who will give us a closing dua, inshallah, because we believe that sisters can give dua too. It's not just for brothers. The information being discussed here is very important. I agree with the different perspectives. Unfortunately, I do believe that the vast majority do not like hearing nor speaking of the truth. Present within our communities, there's a clear division between ethnic groups, those with different financial abilities, and much more. Sheikh Saleem did mention none of this developed overnight. The ongoing problems and barriers we continue to face are due to the integration of, and I can't read the rest of the post because it's on Facebook, but that's part of what cut off. Anyway, Bismillah, Sheikh Saleem, if you can give your closing comments, and Sayyid Ali, and then Sister Hana, her closing comments and dua, inshallah. Bismillah.
Bismillah. Just in short response to what I understood from that remark or that statement of the individual in the chat, it didn't happen overnight. I didn't say that to say that it's going to take forever or that change will come. The issue is not whether or not our efforts result in change. The issue is very simply that we are responsible for making effort for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the attitude that we have to take into it. I agree with the statement of everyone present that, we can multitask as a Muslim community. We can deal with the issue of racism. We can deal with other issues simultaneously, just like we do in life. And as to whether or not this is comfortable, this is a comfortable conversation, let me tell you, paying DTE is not comfortable. Paying Mishkan ain't comfortable. But we live in an uncomfortable world. We need to be uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will push us in that direction of making effort for his pleasure, inshallah ta'ala.
So, first of all, I just want to thank the three of you. I really learned a lot, and it was an honor, and there was a lot of barakah being in the presence of such respected individuals with these beautiful statements that were made today. You know, if I have one thing to say, it's just that this illness, this spiritual illness that we have in ourselves, this is not only, you know, an obstacle to us basically manifesting Islam correctly here in the United States, but it's also an obstacle for us in the next world, right? These spiritual diseases are coming out of us one way or the other. You know, if me and you are not going to take them out of ourselves here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to take it out of us there. So inshallah, we ask Allah to give us the tawfiq to be able to, you know, improve ourselves.
I saw closing comments for me. I think one thing to just, we need to be comfortable with being a little paranoid in regards to when we are crossing lines Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set. And Brother Ali just mentioned that when we talk about racism, it's a spiritual disease. When it comes to spiritual diseases, it's okay to be a little paranoid. It's okay to always be checking over your shoulder because, like he mentioned, you'd rather deal with it here than have to deal with it in the afterlife. With that being said, one thing just I've noticed kind of socially is the extent of heedlessness, both within the Muslim community and outside of the Muslim community, has stretched so far that people are being spiritually starved. And anytime you are starved, you feel that hunger. And so with that spiritual starvation, you are seeing people searching for something. They're searching for some sort of spirituality to fill that hole. And we know as Muslims, if you follow the message of Islam, that hole cannot be filled with other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we see that, it's like Imam Saleem was mentioning, that is an opportunity to offer, here are the Islamic tools to tackle that, because there's no end without that set of tools. And when we're doing that, we have our paranoia, have some grace. And this is me, the have some grace message for me is to, I hate this term, I really don't like using it, social justice warriors, because I feel like it's used to disparage a lot of sometimes well-meaning people, but have some grace when you call something out, when you want to have a conversation. If we are, I was thinking about this earlier, about just because you sit on a high horse doesn't make you any taller, right? If you're 2 feet tall getting on it, you're still 2 feet tall when you get off of it. And so please, when you guys are having this kind, and I don't mean, and please forgive me if I'm being in any way saying anything that I don't mean. I hope you guys can really truly trust my intention is good here. When I say I understand that there's a lot of emotionality and a lot of pain behind it. But when we have these conversations, nobody felt pain like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And whether you want, nobody. And yet he held onto grace. And nobody educated people on the most basic of things like the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ had to tell people to not run around naked around the Kaaba. Yet he entered those conversations with an end goal of helping someone to be better. We can't do that when we're cussing and yelling and canceling and saying, well, you need to educate yourself, and you're not gonna, you can't get any better. That's not how our deen is. So please be mindful in that education, having grace when you do it. I say this because I was having this conversation with myself, and this will be my last sentence when it comes to the situation we were discussing earlier about the salon, is seeing some of the Yemeni reactions that were lacking grace. It was like, so what's our end goal? Is our end goal to truly create change, or was our end goal to terrorize? Right? Was our end goal just to continue? Y'all just want to cuss her out like till the end of the world? Or are we going to say, like, what you did was unacceptable? We caught it. We called it out. Here are the consequences for anyone who ever tries that again. Right? And so with that being said, I'm going to end. Please forgive me for any outstanding remarks. I'm going to end with dua. سبحانك الله وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Oh Allah, we ask you to purify our hearts from all diseases. Oh Allah, we ask you to allow us to stand on the day of judgment in the company of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a time where we have no grief and no fear upon us. Oh Allah, we ask you to not let us have an ounce of pride, an ounce of hypocrisy, or any hateful characteristics in our hearts. Ya Allah, take us at the time that you are most pleased with us. Allow us to be agents of positive, healthy change that is in line with your deen, with your Quran, with your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's authentic sunnah. Protect us from being those who create greater holes in greater issues for the Muslim community and for the greater society. And we ask you to accept from those who watch this and who have benefited from us, and allow us to truly die upon Tawheed. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر.
جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.